Hey guys, so today I'm going to be doing my April wrap up. I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read throughout the month of April, and as usual I'm going to start with my least favourite books and work my way up to my most favourite. This month I had nothing lower than 3 stars, which was really nice. So my first 3-star read for the month was The Cruel Prince by Holly Black, and this is a YA fantasy novel. I think it's going to be the first in a series. This one's about a girl and her 2 sisters. Their parents are killed and then they have to go and live with the Fae, and the Fae kind of don't like humans just because they're different, and in particular there's a prince that she has to do classes and stuff with, and he and his friends are really nasty to her. I kind of enjoyed this book. I really got into the story about halfway through, or maybe 2/3 of the way through. The beginning of it, the pacing was just too slow for me and I found it quite predictable. The reason I really kind of like got into the story at that halfway or 2/3 of the way through point was because there was some sort of political intrigue going on. There was a bit of a rebellion and people trying to overthrow the crown, so that was more appealing to me than the stuff that our main character is going through with the prince and his friends. It's an interesting way of dealing with bullying because essentially that's what is happening in the story. She goes to school every day and is bullied by this group of Fae who think they're better than she is, but I don't like the way that it was dealt with after that. I think certain people were forgiven too easily. In saying that though, this book is extremely violent. It's way more violent than I was expecting it to be. Like, there are some scenes I was like, wow, was not expecting it to be that violent. Overall, I think it wasn't really a book for me, but it was okay. My next 3-star read was one that I had to read for uni, and that was The Crying of Lot 49. This was, as you can see, a very short novel, but it was satire, and I feel like I've said this enough on my channel now that we all know I don't like satire, and this is definitely a book that I wouldn't have picked up had I not had to read it for uni. I pretty much went into this knowing that I probably wasn't going to enjoy it because I just don't enjoy satire. So the basic premise of this book is it follows a woman living in 1960s California. I think this book came out in the 1960s, and her ex-boyfriend from like a long time ago dies and leaves her as executor of his estate, so she has to go out of town and like try and take care of his affairs and that kind of thing. In the course of doing that, she comes across a bit of a mystery that's going on. There's something weird, like an underground postal service, and she basically spends the rest of the novel trying to figure out what's going on with that, and she's never quite sure whether there is something going on or whether maybe she's just crazy or she's reading too much into things, or whether this ex that's left her his estate, perhaps he did it as some kind of cruel setup. So she kind of spends the novel trying to piece together clues and work it out. In saying that, it is satire. It's definitely not a mystery novel or anything like that. I know the storyline sounds like it could be fun in that way, but really, just putting it out there, not a lot gets resolved in this book because it is satire. The main reason that I don't enjoy satire in general is because it just feels like a joke that goes on for too long, and I just don't enjoy that. This book in particular, the plot was really convoluted and there were so many gimmicky characters. I had a lot of trouble keeping up with all of the characters in this novel. They were all very shallow and like served a very specific purpose to the story, which I feel like is the case with satire. Usually the main character, you get a lot of depth out of them, but all the other characters, there's just not much to them. They all had really like gimmicky names and stuff as well. There were moments in the writing that were really beautiful. There were some really great one-liners in this book, and I kind of liked the depth that got into it at some places. There was one quote in this book about how after we're gone, all that's left behind are our words, and I really liked that. There was something about miracles that I really liked as well, and yeah, there were just moments of this writing that I thought was really beautiful, but otherwise it wasn't for me. My next 3-star read was another one that I had to read for uni. This one I was expecting to like a little more than I did, but it's Orlando by Virginia Woolf. The premise of this story is kind of an odd one as well. It follows a young nobleman called Orlando. He is alive in Elizabethan times, so I think it's around the 1500s or 1600s. He pretty much goes through a bunch of different relationships with different women. He gets into different things, like he wants to be a writer, so he's writing poetry and things like that and meeting up with other writers. Orlando basically lives beyond his time. He is alive for centuries but only ages to like the age of 30 or something, and then there's one point in this book where Orlando wakes up one day and Orlando is now a woman. So the pronoun switches to she, and Orlando is the same person, has the same memories and everything like that, but she's now a woman and experiencing the world in a different way than she had previously when she was a man. So it's an interesting idea, and I really liked the way it explored gender constructs. By having a character who goes through both being a man and being a woman, you have those comparisons there obviously. It was told in Virginia Woolf's like typical writing style, which is third person omniscient with a lot of stream of consciousness and a lot of free and direct discourse. So you get a lot from inside Orlando's head, and Orlando is constantly thinking about what it means to be a man versus what it means to be a woman. Orlando was a really incredibly interesting character, but the story for me was not particularly captivating. I just find Virginia Woolf's writing style a little bit too hard to deal with at times. There was one point where I found a sentence that went basically half the length of the entire page, and I know that was kind of her style. It's just not for me. My last 3-star read this month was one that I actually listened to on audiobook. I've just recently started getting audiobooks out of my library. This is the first one I've listened to, and it's When Dimple Met Rishi, and it's about an Indian American girl whose parents are trying to set her up with an Indian American boy, kind of like an arranged marriage. They're not expecting them to actually get married because they've only just finished high school, but they want to see if they can set them up for getting married in the future. Rishi thinks that they're both all for this, and like he's quite keen on the whole idea of the arranged marriage, but Dimple doesn't know anything about it because her parents kind of know that she'd be against it. It's essentially a YA contemporary romance, so that's the main focus of the novel. It's not a genre that I typically read a lot. For me, it's one that I just reach for if I feel like something light and fluffy, which after those uni reads, that's what I was in the mood for. One thing that I really loved about this book was the dynamic between Dimple and Rishi and their families. I loved their interactions with their parents. I just found it super entertaining. In terms of everything else though, like it wasn't bad. It was entertaining and it was kind of heartwarming and a fun read. I wasn't that fussed on the romance itself though, just because Dimple was so indecisive, and I find that really annoying in YA romances when the protagonist is really indecisive about what she wants. And the main like conflict, aside from the whole romance thing that's going on with Rishi, is a group of like mean rich kids that are kind of running the whole scene, and that's just not a storyline that I find particularly interesting. I didn't think those characters were very well developed. They were quite stereotypical, and I just didn't find that whole plotline very interesting. But aside from that, it was a fun like fluffy romance. Moving on to the books that I rated 4 stars this month. One of them was Goodbye Perfect by Sarah Bernard. This one I talked briefly about in my last video, which was about annotating books. This book is about a girl whose best friend runs away with a teacher that she's having like a romance with. So the friend is left behind dealing with really freaked out parents and police and the school and all of their friends and everything. I really enjoyed the way that this book handled the subject matter without being condescending towards the views of teenagers, but it also doesn't romanticize the situation, which I really liked, and it discusses important things like consent for minors and healthy versus unhealthy relationships. The main character has a really healthy relationship with her boyfriend who is the same age as her, and I really liked their relationship together. I thought it was really nice. The only downside of this book for me was that I didn't care for the writing style. It just wasn't my thing. It was kind of overly simplistic. Like for certain characters there would just be a bullet point list of things about them. I'm not a fan of those type of techniques. So the writing style wasn't for me, but I thought the story of this book and the subject matter was dealt with really well. I really enjoyed it. My next 4-star reads were Runaways, issue 5 and 6. So for number 5, I just felt like the humor had come back into it a bit again, and there was a really great cliffhanger at the end of this one. And then this one though, the art, especially in this one, has been by far my favorite out of all of the Runaways comics so far. So this is an example of one of the pages from this issue, and I just think the art in this issue in particular is just stunning. Like it just is beautiful. Another 4-star read I had was Spellbook of the Lost and Found by Moira Fowley Doyle. I've already returned this one to the library, but it was definitely a 4-star read for me. I really enjoyed it. I've got a review of this one up, so I'll link it in the information bar below if you want to check that out. It's about a group of teenagers. A lot of things in their lives are starting to go missing. There was a big party one night, and after that a lot of things got lost, and then they find a spell book and they want to use the spell book to bring back the things that they've lost. So it's kind of creepy and a bit witchy, and it just has this really amazing atmosphere throughout it. That was my favorite thing about it. The writing I thought was amazing, and it just had this, I don't know, this feeling about it. The only thing I didn't like about it was the fact that it was told from multiple point of views, just because I think the girls voices were not distinct enough from one another. They were all in first person and they just sounded like the same person telling a different version of the events. So I didn't love the multiple point of views, but other than that I thought the characters were all great. The storyline was really mysterious, and I think it's a perfect, like, beautiful autumnal witchy read. My final 4-star read was another one that I had to read for uni, and I actually really enjoyed this one. It was Passing by Nella Larson. This is a beautifully written novella. It's set in the 1920s. It's about two women called Irene and Claire who grew up together, like in the same neighborhood. Both of them are African American, but they're white enough to pass for white. Claire has decided that that's how she wanted to live her life, so she ended up marrying a white man and living in a whiter community. Irene, on the other hand, decided to live as a black woman in her own community and kind of not like hide who she was like Claire chose to. So this story follows a time when the two of them are kind of reunited when they're a bit older. They're both married, and looking at kind of what happens when these two different worlds collide. The plot of this was really unexpected for me. It started off dealing really interestingly with the issue of passing and what that kind of experience is like. It's not something I knew anything about beforehand, so it was an interesting exploration of that issue and an exploration of the Harlem Renaissance, which is also something I didn't know much about before going into this book. So I really was enjoying that, and just the dynamic between Irene and Claire. And then the story like takes this turn that I really didn't expect it to take. And it's funny, I finished this like quite a while ago, like it was earlier in the month, and I've had time to think about it now. And at the time when I wrote down my notes for this wrap up, I said that the ending, like the twist that this book took, cheapened the book, and I didn't like it, and I was disappointed, and it was, you know, it was going to be 5 stars for me, and I knocked it back to 4 stars basically because of that twist. Basically there's something that happened that's something that I don't like to read about in fiction, and if you've read this you might know what I mean. But the more that it sat with me and the more that I've thought about it, I think the ending was really impactful, and you can kind of look at it a number of different ways. So that's all I'll say about it, but I think this is probably like a 4.5. It's one that's kind of stuck with me, and I've not been able to like stop thinking about it. So the ending surprised me, like not necessarily in a good way, but it was certainly like, it's made an impact. I would recommend this one if you're at all interested. The final book that I read this month was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This was the Classics Clique book for April, and I have a full spoiler-free review of this one up as well, so I'll link that in the information bar below if you're interested. I really loved this book. It follows a woman who marries a man whose previous wife has passed away, so she goes to live on his estate with him, but the memory of his deceased wife is kind of like hanging around, and this new wife feels really inadequate. It's a bit mysterious. I just loved the setting and the writing. I thought the writing was like the standout thing of this book for me. It was beautiful, amazing. I highly recommend this one. It was fantastic. So those are all of the books that I read throughout the month of April. If you've read any of them, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, or if you're going to check any of them out, let me know that as well. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in a couple of days with my May TBR. Thanks for watching. Bye.